Her name was Eve Carson, a bright student who vanished from her own home in the middle of the night, leaving absolutely no trace behind. Police immediately launched a search, but a dark reality soon unfolded before them. By piecing together scarce clues, they uncovered exactly what happened to her, and the truth of this case shook the entire country. Eve Carson was born on November 19, 1985, in Athens, Georgia. From a young age, she was known for her incredible determination. Eve served as the student body vice president at her high school and dedicated her time to charity work, volunteering at nursing homes and shelters for troubled youth. In high school, she even worked as a page in the U.S. House of Representatives and held a job in a stem cell research lab. Graduating as valedictorian, Eve attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill on a prestigious scholarship, where she double majored in political science and biology. She was a central figure in campus life, holding leadership positions in numerous student organizations. On top of all that, she continued her charitable work and tutored elementary school students in science. Eve also traveled the world on service missions. She spent a summer in Ecuador working as a medical assistant, studied abroad in Cuba for a semester, and visited Egypt with a research group. Eve was, by all accounts, one of the most outstanding students at her university, with a bright future ahead. Even before graduation, she had already secured a job at a top-tier consulting firm. In March 2008, at the age of 22, she was nearing the end of her senior year. At the time, she was renting a house near campus with friends. On March 5th, around 1:30 a.m., her roommates headed out to a party and invited Eve along. She declined, needing to study for the next day. Her friends left without her and returned around 4:30 a.m. Approaching the house, they noticed the front door was wide open and the lights were on inside. But Eve was nowhere to be found, and her car was missing from the driveway. It was bizarre. Her friends couldn't understand where she would go in the middle of the night, or why she would leave the door open. They tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. Despite the worry, they assumed she might have had an urgent errand and decided to wait for her return. However, by the next day, Eve still hadn't appeared. One of her friends went to the local police station to file a missing person report. As soon as the friend explained the situation, officers revealed grim news. Early that morning, they had found a young woman who had passed away, but she was still unidentified. Police showed the friend a photograph, and she immediately recognized Eve. It turned out that around 5 a.m., police received a call from a woman living about 1.5 miles from Eve's house. She had woken up to the sound of loud pops, followed by a piercing scream. Terrified, she called the authorities. When police arrived on that street, they found the victim. She had no ID on her, which is why she remained a Jane Doe. The only thing investigators knew for sure was that she had sustained fatal injuries from a weapon. After the identification, detectives spoke with neighbors to build a timeline. At 12:30 a.m., Eve was home studying. By 5 a.m., her life had been taken a mile away. Now, police had to figure out how she got there and who was responsible. Since her car was missing, investigators theorized the motive was robbery. Supporting this theory, a search of Eve's room revealed her wallet and bank cards were gone, and they weren't found at the scene either. Medical examiners found no signs of physical assault, ruling out one common motive. Police tracked her phone, finding it was last active near a highway outside of town, but the device was never recovered. It seemed the perpetrator had tossed the phone into a wooded area. However, detectives soon got a break, a report of an abandoned vehicle matching Eve's car. It was found just a few miles from her home. Investigators handed the vehicle over to forensics to sweep for fingerprints and DNA. Meanwhile, digital forensics on Eve's computer showed she had been using it until 3:30 a.m. This meant she was safe at home for at least 2 hours after her roommates left. Somehow, after that time, she ended up miles away. By then, news of the tragedy had spread across the city. The campus was in shock. Eve was known by almost everyone, and nobody could believe she was gone. Panic set in among the student body. The lack of leads only fueled the fear. Police received hundreds of tips, but nothing brought them closer to solving the mystery. Then, a crucial piece of evidence emerged. Suspecting the cards were stolen, police tracked the bank records. They found that just 18 minutes after Eve last used her computer, someone withdrew $700 from her account in 2 transactions. The person tried to withdraw more, but was declined due to the daily limit. This ATM was at a shopping center on the other side of town. Security footage showed a man using Eve's card. He was driving her car, and there appeared to be someone else in the back seat. Detectives suspected the person in the back might be Eve, but the video quality was too poor to be sure. Attempts to enhance the footage failed. While trying to identify the driver, they learned the perpetrators tried other ATMs across the city, but those locations lacked cameras. This continued until March 7th, when police got another hit. This time, a suspect entered a convenience store at 12:30 a.m. to use the ATM. The transaction was declined. Police rushed to the store in a neighboring town. The security cameras there were working. The footage showed a man trying to use Eve's card, but it was a different man than the one in the first video. Police realized they were looking for multiple suspects, or perhaps the card had been passed along. They released the images to the media, hoping the public could help. On March 12th, a tip came in. An anonymous caller identified the man in the second video as Demario Atwater. Detectives dug into his background and found a significant criminal history. At 21, Demario had multiple prior convictions. He had served time and was currently on probation. In fact, he was due in court just 2 days after Eve's tragedy for a probation violation involving a weapon. Comparing mugshots to the security footage, it was a match. Officers went to his home near the convenience store. Demario denied everything, but the video evidence was enough for an arrest. Police also learned Demario was friends with a 17-year-old named Lawrence Levet, who also had a criminal record despite his age. Looking at his photo, detectives immediately recognized him as the driver from the first ATM video. Unlike Demario, Lawrence didn't go quietly. He barricaded himself in a house, requiring a SWAT team to extract him. Both suspects denied involvement. However, cell tower data placed their phones near Eve's street on the night of the incident, despite them living in a different city. Detectives pieced together the theory. Demario and Lawrence chose Eve at random. They were likely looking for a robbery target and saw her alone in the house late at night. They forced her into her own car and drove her to ATMs, forcing her to reveal her PIN. After hitting the withdrawal limit, they drove her to a secluded area on the outskirts of town and ended her life. Due to the severity of the crime, prosecutors sought the ultimate penalty for Demario. Lawrence, being a minor, faced life imprisonment. To ensure a conviction, prosecutors offered Demario a plea deal. Plead guilty to avoid the ultimate penalty. He accepted. He confirmed they spotted Eve through a window and broke in. Throughout the ordeal, Eve pleaded for her life, promising not to call the police. But Demario admitted they decided to end it because she had seen their faces, even though they made no effort to hide them. Demario added a heartbreaking detail. Before the end, Eve asked them to pray with her. Instead, they committed the fatal act. In April 2010, Demario received 2 life sentences plus 30 years. He apologized to Eve's parents in court. Lawrence refused to plead guilty. His trial began in December 2011. Despite his defense, the evidence and his partner's testimony led to a guilty verdict and a life sentence. However, in 2013, an appellate court overturned his sentencing, citing new laws regarding life sentences for minors. During his resentencing, Lawrence spoke, claiming, "Everyone makes mistakes, and he wasn't a monster." He showed no true remorse. The court reinstated his life sentence. Notably, Lawrence was also a suspect in the fatality of a 29-year-old student months prior, but charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Eve's case changed state laws, increasing penalties for crimes committed by groups. Her university established a scholarship in her name and created a memorial garden on campus. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. A young woman who had just recently graduated from high school and started her first job set off to another city for a work seminar, but she never reached her destination. Soon, police joined the search, and investigators began uncovering one clue after another. They quickly realized that something truly terrible might have happened to the young woman, but solving this case proved far more difficult than it seemed at first glance. It was only nearly 3 decades later that they finally managed to close the book on this investigation, but its outcome turned out to be completely different from what anyone expected to see. Barrett Beck was born on April 12th in the small American town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. It was a quiet and peaceful place where, according to the residents themselves, no significant events ever occurred, neither good nor bad. The town was distinguished by its measured pace of life, low crime rate, and popularity among families with children. Barrett lived there with her parents and younger brother, studied at the local school, and had many friends. One of the main passions in her life was music. The girl was a member of her school orchestra, where she played the violin. In high school, Barrett began dating a guy named Kurt, and their relationship continued after graduation. At the time of her graduation in the summer of 1990, Barrett was 18, and she was reflecting on her future plans. The girl intended to go to college, but had not yet decided on a profession. She considered various options, but they were all united by the fact that they were somehow connected to music. In addition to this, Barrett took a job to save up money before entering college. She received a position in the office of a fairly large company, and in July of that year, she was scheduled to attend a 3-day seminar where employees were trained in computer work. For Barrett, this was quite a serious step. The girl, who had graduated from school only a few weeks ago, needed to travel to another city located several hundred miles from her home. At first, her parents reacted to this trip rather skeptically. They worried about their daughter, who had to cover such a distance alone and spend several days in an unfamiliar city. But in the end, they accepted it, since Barrett was already an adult and the seminar was necessary for her work. On the morning of July 17th, they gave her the family van, helped her pack her things for the road, and the girl set off. She promised to call them as soon as she checked into the hotel. However, time passed, and Barrett did not make contact. Her parents, who were already worried about their daughter, began to worry even more, since the road to that city should have taken only a few hours. Toward evening, the parents called the hotel and found out that the girl had never checked into her room. They also called her colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. None of them had seen Barrett that day. Despite all this, the parents held on to hope that everything was fine with their daughter. They assumed the girl might have changed plans and checked into another hotel or stayed with someone she knew. For this reason, they decided to wait until morning. But when her work seminar began and Barrett did not appear there, the parents decided to contact the police. Officers joined the search. However, initially they limited themselves to sending out an alert for her vehicle. The girl was a legal adult, and the police had no evidence that she could have become a victim of a crime, so they did not launch a full-scale search operation. Throughout the entire day, Barrett never made contact with her parents and did not appear at the work seminar. Police also failed to locate her vehicle or any clues whatsoever. The next day also brought no news. However, everything changed on July 19th. The police received a report about a similar van parked at a supermarket in the small town of West Bend, 60 miles from Barrett's home. Officers immediately established that this vehicle belonged to the girl's family and proceeded to examine it. The van doors turned out to be locked, and Barrett herself was not inside. First of all, police found a receipt from a pharmacy located across the street from the parking lot. It was issued during the day on July 17th, the day of the girl's disappearance. A pharmacy employee confirmed that the girl had indeed come in around noon. She was alone, in a good mood, and nothing in her behavior aroused suspicion. The car was also missing a radar detector and the radio, which pointed to a possible robbery. However, further study of the van brought more questions than answers. There was quite a lot of cigarette ash in the car's cabin. Considering that Barrett had never smoked in her life, someone else must have been in the van. And judging by the amount of ash, they spent quite a lot of time there. Another strange fact was that practically all of the girl's belongings were still lying in the van. Her red shirt, in which she left home, was lying on the floor, and a piece of fabric had been torn from it. The dress she intended to wear to the seminar was also lying nearby, and her stockings were tied in a knot. The boots in which the girl left home were also in the van. In addition to all this, the police noticed another strange point. Before the parents gave Barrett their van, they wrote down the mileage, since the girl's company was supposed to cover all travel expenses. After checking the data, they realized that the odometer had added an extra 460 miles. Considering that it was only 60 miles from Barrett's home to this parking lot, someone must have driven the car a much greater distance before abandoning it in front of the supermarket. Another fact pointing to the presence of another person in the van was several paper coffee cups, one from McDonald's, the second from Burger King. Considering that Barrett apparently drove only about 60 miles before something happened to her, detectives doubted she had time to stop at 2 different places for coffee. All these facts led investigators to the thought that Barrett could have become a victim of abduction, or her van was simply stolen. However, the second version turned out to be unlikely, since the girl had not been in touch for several days and her whereabouts remained unknown. Police tried to recreate the chronology of events of that day and understand her route. First, they found out that the girl did not hit the road immediately after leaving home. First, she stopped by her boyfriend, Kurt. The young man said that they talked for some time, discussed her upcoming trip to the seminar, after which Barrett left. Since then, he had not contacted her, and the police found no evidence that he could have had any relation to her disappearance. However, investigators did learn one interesting fact. Kurt gave her a rather expensive ring. The girl never took it off, Yet experts who studied the van found this ring under one of the floor mats. Its location suggested that someone placed the ring there on purpose, as it was quite difficult to imagine how it could fly off a finger and get under the rug. If we assume that an unknown criminal removed the ring from the girl, another question arose. Why did he take the radar and radio, but leave an expensive piece of jewelry? Meanwhile, forensics finished a detailed analysis of the van and found dozens of different fingerprints in it. Police asked all of Barrett's friends and relatives to provide their prints to exclude them from this list. And in the end, they were left with several unidentified prints. On a coffee cup, on the inside of one of the windows, and on boxes of cosmetics that Barrett bought at the pharmacy. Nevertheless, without suspects, these prints in no way brought investigators closer to solving the case. While police tried to discover new clues, the girl's relatives organized massive searches. They attracted more than 100 volunteers, gave interviews to local TV channels, and went to comb through hundreds of miles of the route along which their daughter was supposed to drive. In addition to this, they raised $75,000, which was offered as a reward for information about Barrett's whereabouts. In the following weeks, investigators received a number of tips, but none of them brought them closer to solving this mystery. This continued for more than a month, until, on August 22nd, a call came into the police. A local farmer was driving along a rural road about 18 miles from where Barrett's van was found. He noticed something strange in a ditch next to the roadside and decided to stop to take a closer look. To his horror, the man realized that human remains were in front of him and immediately reported this to the police. Officers confirmed that these were indeed the remains of a woman, but due to the high degree of decomposition, it was impossible to visually establish her identity. However, detectives immediately assumed that the deceased could be Barrett, and a comparison with her dental records confirmed this version. Due to decomposition, medical experts were also unable to find any obvious injuries that could indicate the cause of the tragedy. They only assumed that the victim might have passed away from asphyxiation. But one thing was clear for sure: the police were dealing with a crime. Besides obvious facts pointing to this version, there was something else. On the victim's head was a piece of fabric from her shirt, tied like a blindfold. This led to the thought that the girl was indeed abducted and held alive for some time. However, it was most likely only a matter of a few hours, since, according to the medical examiner's report, the remains had lain next to this road for more than a month. Thus, the police assumed that the criminal ended her life on the day of the abduction. Nevertheless, the discovery of the remains brought investigators no new clues, and since then, there was no movement in this case. For months, police considered various suspects and tried to find new evidence, but all this led to a dead end. According to investigators, Barrett became a victim of a robbery that did not go according to plan. They assumed that when the girl stopped near the shopping center and went to the pharmacy, someone climbed into her van. Perhaps this person planned to steal only valuables, but Barrett returned too early and caught him in the car. Then he made the decision to abduct her, after which he ended her life and left the remains in that ditch. At the same time, based on the odometer readings, the criminal drove the van for some time, racking up almost 500 miles. Considering that robbery was considered as the main motive, police began to look closely at those who were engaged in similar businesses in that area. Soon, their attention was attracted by a man named Craig, who was suspected of a series of car thefts not far from that very shopping center. In addition, the criminal often used stolen cars to commit other offenses and also drove them for some time, which fell under the actions of the person responsible for Barrett's tragedy. Detectives began to study Craig's possible involvement and found out that shortly after Barrett's disappearance, he was arrested for armed bank robbery. Having studied the materials of this case, police found out that during the arrest, the man had a bag with him, in which, among other things, lay a woman's hairbrush with blonde hair. However, in those years, experts could not yet conduct DNA analysis and compare the hair with the genetic sample of the victim, so the police could not establish an unconditional match. Nevertheless, they learned that Craig theoretically had the opportunity to commit this crime, but this also did not prove his guilt. Soon, detectives received a new clue that radically changed the course of this case. Police interviewed several of Craig's friends, and one of them suddenly stated that the man confessed to him about ending Barrett's life. Moreover, he allegedly showed him the girl's remains in her van before getting rid of them. All this forced detectives to seriously consider Craig as the main suspect. However, there was one problem. His fingerprints did not match those found inside the van. He himself also refused to admit his guilt, and investigators began to think about how to prove his involvement. In the following months, they tried to find new evidence, but this led to nothing. Police considered the possibility of bringing official charges against him, hoping that the testimony of Craig's acquaintance would be enough for a guilty verdict. But in the end, they realized that without any weighty evidence, the prosecution would simply have no chance in court. Despite this, Craig remained the main suspect in this case, and in subsequent years, detectives did not abandon attempts to find proof of his guilt. However, there was practically no movement in this case, and the investigation effectively froze for several decades. This continued until 2013, when this case was transferred to the cold case team for re-examination. When detectives began to study the materials and available evidence, a very unpleasant surprise awaited them. Practically all of Barrett's clothing was missing from the warehouse. Although it was listed among the documents, the police could never find these items. Apparently, one of the officers accidentally threw away all these objects. Despite this, investigators still sent all remaining evidence to the laboratory for reanalysis, and also requested a fresh comparison of existing fingerprints. To the surprise of the police, they found out that in the 23 years since the tragedy, these prints had never been entered into digital databases, and they were still stored on paper. Soon, the lead detective received a call from the laboratory. Experts reported that after uploading the prints to the database, 5 of them showed a match with prints already available there. They belonged to a man named Dennis Brantner. Police immediately established that this name had never figured in the case files. At the same time, he had a criminal history, as a result of which his fingerprints got into the database. In his youth, Dennis received a prison term for car theft and was later arrested for breaking into someone else's house. In addition, the man once sneaked into a hotel room where a woman unknown to him lived, stole her underwear, and left notes with obscene content. Another episode seemed quite important to detectives in the context of the Barrett case. Once, Dennis climbed into his ex-wife's car while she was at work and began waiting for her. When she got into the car, the man took out a weapon and tried to abduct her. However, the woman managed to escape. Detectives began to study this person and found out that during the years of the tragedy, he worked as a truck driver in that county and constantly traveled between hundreds of settlements. This gave him a hypothetical opportunity to meet the girl. Police still did not rush to conclusions. First, they made sure that Dennis was not acquainted with the girl or anyone from her family, which, in theory, could be an explanation for the presence of his fingerprints in their family van. However, one important point contradicted this version. One of Dennis's fingerprints was found on the box of cosmetics that Barrett bought just a few minutes before her disappearance. This meant that the man was in the van at that very moment and strengthened suspicion toward him. Investigators decided to talk to him and headed to his home. Dennis immediately began to deny any involvement in the tragedy and insisted that he had never met Barrett. But when the police told him that his fingerprints were found in her van, the man began to get very nervous and at some moments even cried answering their questions. But despite this, he continued to insist on his own. Therefore, detectives again focused on finding additional clues. Having interviewed Dennis's acquaintances, they learned several interesting points at once. His ex-wife said that the man loved Burger King and constantly ate there. Barrett, on the contrary, preferred McDonald's. And as we remember, coffee cups from both establishments were found in her van. At the same time, Dennis's fingerprint was on the cup from Burger King. Then, investigators talked to former colleagues of the man, and here an even more interesting discovery awaited them. After the tragedy with Barrett, Dennis worked at a factory for some time. 3 of his colleagues told detectives that at that time, the man kept a photo of some young girl with blonde hair in his tool chest. Unfortunately, after all these years, it was impossible to establish if it was Barrett, but colleagues said the girl really looked like that photo. Another former colleague of Dennis said that once the man directly stated that he wanted to abduct her and subject her to violence. While police were collecting all this information, they also received news from the laboratory. Despite the fact that officers had lost part of Barrett's things in the past, there were still quite a few items from her car in the warehouse, including a wrapper from a cigarette pack. Having studied it using modern instruments, forensic scientists found a new fingerprint on it, which also belonged to Dennis. Collecting all this information and evidence took almost a year, and in March 2015, the man was arrested on charges of causing the tragedy. However, there was one significant problem here. Despite the presence of Dennis's fingerprints in the victim's car, the prosecution feared that this might not be enough. The problem was that by 2015, everyone was already used to DNA, and fingerprints seemed much less reliable confirmation of guilt. If the suspect's DNA on the victim's body was practically unconditional evidence of involvement, then fingerprints in the car interior could theoretically have been left under other circumstances, and they did not indicate a direct link of the suspect to the tragedy. Despite all the efforts of experts, they never managed to find a single sample of Dennis's DNA on the things or in the victim's car, not to mention her remains. Nevertheless, this case was still transferred to court, and the process began in the summer of 2016. Dennis's lawyer latched onto the fact that the prosecution had no direct evidence of his client's guilt, and in the end, he managed to sow doubt among the jury. As a result, they could not come to a unanimous decision, and the process was declared a mistrial. The prosecution immediately announced that it would prepare for a second trial. For Barrett's relatives, what was happening became a serious test. For 26 years, they had no idea what happened to the girl, and now they had to watch as the person whom the police unequivocally considered guilty avoided punishment. The second trial was scheduled for the beginning of 2018, and here certain difficulties arose again. According to the prosecution, Dennis attacked the victim with the aim of severe assault and subsequent tragedy. However, proving the existence of such intentions in the suspect was even more difficult. Considering that the possible punishment depended on this, the prosecution faced an extremely difficult task. If they could not convince the jury to find him guilty, then the man could no longer be tried for this crime again, and he could go free. After long deliberations and discussions with Barrett's relatives, the prosecution came to a painful compromise. They decided to offer Dennis a deal under which he had to plead guilty to second-degree reckless homicide. Such a step guaranteed that the criminal would go behind bars, albeit for a much shorter term, and the case would be solved after 28 long years. Having consulted with a lawyer, Dennis accepted this proposal, and he was sentenced to the maximum possible term under this article, 10 years in prison. At the same time, the years he had been in prison since his arrest were counted toward the term. As a result, since he had already served a significant part, he could be released at the age of 67. The victim's parents, for obvious reasons, were frustrated by such a lenient sentence. However, they understood that in the event of refusing the deal, there was a very high probability that Dennis would avoid even such punishment. For this reason, they supported the deal proposal, fearing to miss the only chance to bring the perpetrator to justice. In memory of Barrett, they also established a scholarship at her high school, which was given for success in music, and it is still active to this day. It is also worth noting that several decades later, police managed to refute the testimony against Craig, the first suspect in this case. As we remember, one of his acquaintances said that Craig showed him Barrett's remains in her van, but this turned out to be a lie. In reality, this person wanted to settle a score with Craig, so he used information he heard from the police to frame him. Share your opinion about this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video. Thanks for watching. A 17-year-old girl vanished from the pharmacy where she worked part-time. At first, everyone assumed she had simply gone home, but when the manager began reviewing the security footage, he saw something alarming and eventually uncovered a chilling truth. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Riley Whitelaw and why this case sparked public outrage. Riley Whitelaw was born on January 20th, 2005, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. From an early age, the girl was passionate about drawing, dancing, and playing the guitar. She achieved significant success in all these endeavors. Riley won prizes in various city and school competitions with her paintings. In high school, she volunteered at a charity organization helping animals. Riley spent almost all her free time there, despite a busy study schedule. At 16, she also took a job at a pharmacy to earn her own pocket money. Riley spent several days a week there, balancing work with school and volunteering. She quickly found common ground with the team and was generally happy with the job. On June 11, 2022, she arrived for her shift at the pharmacy as usual. Around 5:30 p.m., Riley went to the staff break room for her scheduled lunch. Half an hour later, the manager noticed that Riley had not returned to her post. She walked around the store but couldn't find her, after which she called the morning shift manager and asked him to return to the pharmacy. Initially, they thought the girl had simply left her shift without notifying management. The second manager decided to verify this and began checking security camera footage from across the store. When he got to the recording from the staff break room, the manager noticed something strange. Hours earlier, another employee had stacked boxes of products on top of each other in such a way that the resulting structure completely blocked the security camera's view. This was suspicious because that room was not intended for storing merchandise at all. The manager also noticed that the room's windows were covered with paper and tape. The man clearly remembered that during his morning shift, none of this was there. Finally, he saw that a closed sign was hanging on the public restroom, which was also odd. That area was usually only locked when the store closed. Ultimately, the manager decided to check inside the staff break room. His colleague, who had previously walked through the entire pharmacy looking for Riley, hadn't entered that room because she assumed the girl would have left long ago after lunch. The manager headed there around 7 p.m., and to his horror, he found Riley on the floor. There were significant signs of a struggle and visible injuries, and the man immediately called the police. Investigators arrived to examine the scene and immediately realized they were dealing with a crime. First, they spoke with the managers, who told them about the strange footage and the covered windows. Detectives immediately asked for the name of the employee who had blocked the surveillance cameras with boxes. It turned out to be 28-year-old Joshua Johnson. However, he was no longer at the pharmacy. None of his colleagues saw him leave the store, but the evening shift manager shared an interesting fact with the detectives. When the woman was looking for Riley, she looked outside and smelled a strong scent of bleach coming from the dumpsters. She wanted to get closer, but a man's voice called out from behind the bins, claiming he was changing clothes and asking her not to look. The woman was very surprised and returned to the pharmacy to tell her colleague. When they went outside together, there was no one near the dumpsters, but an empty bottle of bleach was lying on the ground. Police quickly managed to find the first witness. A female customer was in the pharmacy around 5:44 p.m. when she heard a female scream and some noise. The scream ended quickly, and the woman didn't give it much thought. Similar statements were given by several other customers and even other pharmacy employees. They all heard a muffled female cry, yet none of them investigated what was happening. Thus, investigators established a rough timeline of that evening's events. Riley was supposed to be on lunch from 5:30 to 6, and during this break, she was attacked. For nearly an hour, the pharmacy managers couldn't find her until one of them decided to look into the break room. Meanwhile, medical experts examined the victim and determined that she had sustained 42 injuries from a sharp object, as well as trauma to the head. Based on the available information, police suspected Joshua Johnson of the act. Not only had he covered the camera in that room hours before the tragedy, but he also fled the pharmacy shortly after the incident without notifying management of his departure mid-shift. But that was far from the only thing pointing to his potential involvement. After speaking with Riley's friends and relatives, they uncovered a disturbing fact. The girl had repeatedly complained about harassment from Joshua. Mostly, he tried to persuade her to go on a date with him and constantly made various personal compliments that made the girl uncomfortable. When she started working at the store, she was 16, and Joshua was 27. Despite this, and despite Riley's constant refusals and complaints, the man didn't even think about giving up. As a result, the girl approached the manager and asked him to deal with this problem. He promised to take necessary measures, but in the end, the man only spoke to Joshua and asked him to behave more professionally in the workplace. Naturally, this brought no results, and Joshua continued his attempts to win the girl over. In March 2022, the situation only worsened. Riley's boyfriend got a job at the same pharmacy, and Joshua was extremely unhappy about this fact. According to his colleagues, he was jealous of Riley and behaved quite aggressively. The situation was aggravated by the fact that all three worked on the same shifts. In late May, just a few weeks before the tragedy, Riley again approached management and asked to change her work schedule so it wouldn't overlap with Joshua's shifts. She explained that his behavior was getting worse and it was simply impossible to work with him. However, the manager stated they couldn't completely change her schedule. He offered her work at different times, but with a reduction in hours. Even though this meant a significant drop in income, Riley agreed. A few days before the incident, she went to the manager again and asked for more hours. He said this was only possible if Riley took evening shifts again, where she would have to work with Joshua. The girl had to agree because, with the reduced hours, her income had dropped significantly. Thus, for a whole year, Riley tried to get management to take some action that would allow her not to worry about her safety, but they only shrugged their shoulders. Knowing all this, the police became even more convinced of Joshua's involvement. That same evening, they put out a warrant for him. The next day, the man was found. Patrol officers noticed him walking along the shoulder of a highway near the city of Trinidad, more than 100 miles from the scene of the crime. As soon as they stopped and approached Joshua, officers noticed scratches on his face, neck, and hands. Additionally, there were dark stains on his clothes. He offered no resistance and went with him to the station. Meanwhile, detectives located Joshua's car, abandoned under a railroad overpass. Inside, they found stained towels and bandages, as well as disposable razor blades. According to police, Joshua had tried to cut his own hair, but only partially succeeded. The floor mats were also missing from the car. In the first interrogation, he claimed he didn't harm Riley. According to Joshua, that day he went into the break room and saw the girl on the floor. Standing over her was an unknown man armed with a weapon. Joshua claimed he lunged at him, and as a result of a short struggle, he received those scratches. At some point, he managed to break free and run away. Detectives asked why he didn't call the police or tell anyone what happened. Joshua's answer was very strange. He said the attacker knew his home address, so he got scared and decided to stay silent. Naturally, investigators were in no hurry to believe this dubious story. Security cameras didn't record any outsiders who could have entered the staff room. On the contrary, the footage clearly showed Joshua himself blocking the camera's view with boxes. When asked why he did that, the man began to deny it, despite undeniable evidence. Later, he slightly changed his story and said he went into the staff room, slipped in a pool of fluid, stained his clothes, and went home to change. At the same time, Joshua stated he hadn't had any romantic feelings for Riley for a long time. He admitted he tried to court her during their first months working together, but later he entered into a romantic relationship with his female boss. The woman immediately refuted these words and said she and Joshua communicated exclusively on work matters. Shortly after his arrest, the man was charged with first-degree offenses. In September, he appeared in court for the first time for a preliminary hearing. The judge listened to several witnesses from among Riley's colleagues, as well as detectives on the case. They all expressed complete confidence in Joshua's involvement and stated that no one else had the motive or physical opportunity to commit this crime. According to the investigation, Joshua had planned this act from the very beginning of his shift. He covered the camera in the staff room and taped up the windows, then waited for Riley to go on her lunch break. When she was in the room, he attacked her, but the girl put up resistance. She scratched his face and hands, but ultimately, Joshua took her life. Then he tried to wipe up the evidence with towels, but failed. Apparently, he didn't expect the victim to fight back so hard and interfere with his plans to hide the deed. Realizing he couldn't clean up, the man decided to simply flee. Before that, he tried to wash the stains off his clothes with bleach, after which he threw the stained towels into the car and drove away. Joshua's lawyer, in turn, insisted that there was no significant evidence against his client. He suggested the crime could have been committed by someone else and that Joshua was innocent. The man currently remains in custody awaiting trial. If he claims innocence, the process could drag on for several years. However, no one has the slightest doubt that he is behind this tragedy. With his ridiculous versions of events, he only strengthens suspicions against himself. However, Joshua is not the only one blamed for Riley's passing. After this story hit the news, people accused the pharmacy's management of inaction that led to the tragedy. If the managers had listened to her complaints and requests, the sad outcome could have been avoided. Future court hearings on this case are scheduled for the coming months, and we may learn some new details. For now, share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you found it interesting. Thanks for watching.